Jupiter in the 11th house, Aries. In this episode, we're going to get into all the ins and outs about that, and we'll have a look at it in a real life scenario via the birth chart of Phil Spector. To understand Jupiter in Aries in the 11th house, we'll use the same three-part approach that we use for understanding any planet in any sign and house. The three parts are to understand, first of all, what the planet signifies in that house. So in this case, what does Jupiter in the 11th house signify? The second part is to understand what the planet signifies in that sign. So in this case, what about Jupiter in Aries? And the third part is to understand the lordships that are implicated by putting that planet in that sign in that house. So let's start off with step one, part one, figuring out the planet in the house. What does Jupiter in the 11th house symbolize? Well, that is exactly what episode 1 of this series was about. So you can watch that for the details. But to summarize it in a nutshell, Jupiter in the 11th house signifies being wealthy, being a performer, or having a lot of performance-ness to one's personality and expressiveness, and also being non-authoritarian. So this is not what Jupiter in the 11th house in Aries necessarily represents, but it's the basic template of what Jupiter in the 11th house represents. Now we need to consider what Jupiter in Aries represents. I also already did a whole video about that, and you could watch that as well for all the details. I'll put a link to it in the description. The summary of that is that Jupiter in Aries signifies being very competitive, having a lot of ambition, and sort of being the dominant or commanding one, and also being non-conformist. So now we come to step 3, which is sort of the trickier one. Step 3 is the lordships that are implied by that planet being in that sign and house. So if Aries is the 11th house, then Jupiter's signs, Sagittarius and Pisces, must be the 7th and the 10th houses. So if Jupiter is in Aries in the 11th house, part of what makes it symbolize what it symbolizes is the fact that the 7th and the 10th lords are in the 11th house. So we should try to understand what that means. Just do it by deconstructing the houses and putting them together in a resonant way. So the 7th house symbolizes social life and interactive situations. The 10th house signifies the public world, visible things, and so on. And the 11th house is all about performance and profit. So if we put the 7th and the 10th lords in the 11th house, we're getting a synergy on, first of all, performance skills. The ability to know how to interact, know how to express, know how to communicate. Because you got social, interactive, and public all going into the performancing place. And also you have good synergy for sales know-how, because the 11th house is profit, and the 7th has to do with exchange, interacting with people, and the 10th has to do with business. So those are the two things from the 7th and 10th lords being in the 11th house: performance skill and sales skill. Now we've completed our 3-step process. The 4th step then is to just synthesize the relevant strands or threads between these 3 steps. For example, Jupiter in the 11th house symbolizes someone who's very performancy or good with performance. And so does the 7th and the 10th lord in the 11th. It's also performance skill. So if you have Jupiter in the 11th house, Aries, the interpretation is they're a very communicative performer. A lot comes out of them when they're in front of people, and they know how to express, what to show, and how to show it. They know how to communicate. They know how to present media. Another strand that synergizes between all these 3 is that Jupiter in the 11th house is symbolized wealth, and the 7th and 10th lords in the 11th house is good sales skills. So expect a person with Jupiter in Aries 11th house to be successful in marketing. They know how to market things. They know how to make people want what they have, what they're selling, and also they know what people want to buy. A third strand that's synergizing between these 3 sets of symbolisms is that Jupiter in the 11th is non-authoritarian and Jupiter in Aries is non-conformist. So if Jupiter is in Aries in the 11th house, you should really expect the person to be unconventional, at least. Probably countercultural or subcultural or anti-authoritarian. Now, it's always extremely important to look at how these things, these theories, work in the real cases. So let's look at the real case of Phil Spector. So Phil Spector, you can really see what we're talking about with a communicative performer. This is the man who basically invented the way that music sounds today, the way that modern pop recorded music sounds. It's basically because of him. So he knows all about media. He really had an instinct for media. Also successful marketer. He knows what people wanted to hear, and he knows how to make people want what he could produce. And also you can sort of see countercultural working in his case, because first of all, he's a social deviant. And second of all, he's associated most directly with the countercultural music of the 60s. Now that's the easy part about Phil Spector. But don't shy away from the difficult questions, right? So like, for example, Phil Spector is absolutely disgusting, evil person. How does that relate to what we just learned about Jupiter and Aries in the 11th house? It's important to sort that out so that you don't mix your apples and oranges or bleed your symbolisms or interpretations into each other. To figure out how a template really works, you really have to look at the entire chart that template is being put into. So if we look at Phil Spector's chart, right away it becomes obvious, oh, it's not just Jupiter in Aries in the 11th house. It's also Saturn in Aries in the 11th house. Now, I have not yet done the video explaining in depth Saturn in Aries in the 11th house, but if you just know about dignity, and if you even have basic misconceptions about Saturn, then you already kind of have a clue that a debilitated Saturn thrown into this mix is definitely going to change the way this soup comes out tasting. Not only does he also have Saturn debilitated in this 11th house, it's also conjunct Ketu. So he's really got an intensified, debilitated Saturn sitting there with his otherwise pretty good-looking Jupiter in Aries in the 11th house. So this answers the question of why this man was actually just disgusting. Why is he a murderer? Why is he a tormentor? It's because he has this debilitated, intensified Saturn putting its trademark 60-degree aspect onto his ascendant. Meanwhile, the other malefic, Mars, is putting its trademark 90-degree aspect to the same spot. So you can describe him as a highly malefic person with Jupiter and Aries in the 11th house, and not bleed the things together and think that Jupiter and Aries in the 11th house makes a highly malefic person. You can also see how his deviance and badness is sexually oriented, because first of all, his debilitated Saturn in the 11th is the 8th lord. Second of all, he has a lot of focus in that area since his sun is in the 8th house and since his first lord is in the 7th. And to just top it all off or add confidence to the sense that this isn't really a beautiful example of Jupiter and Aries in the 11th house, you can notice that his moon has something called Kamadruma, which is a yoga or a condition where the moon has no neighbors in its own sign nor in either of the adjoining signs. Now, he's not just evil, he's also really, really important to the history of music in the modern world and what it sounds like today. So you could wonder, is that all from Jupiter and Aries in the 11th house, or is there something else? Well, there is other things that are quite important. It's pretty significant when you get the Sun, Venus, and Mercury in 3 different signs, as is the case with him. It spreads out Venus and Mercury from the Sun, and gives more of their qualities, which are very favorable to artistic things. Notice that it's not just Jupiter in Aries in his 11th house, but Jupiter is in Aries in the 11th house, while the Lord of Aries, Mars, is in Pisces in the 10th. He doesn't just have the 10th and 7th lords in the 11th house. He has a house exchange going between the 10th and the 11th. Finally, he's very, very, very wealthy person. Is that just from Jupiter in Aries in the 11th house? No. One thing that's very important to note is that his first lord is aspecting the first house. And besides the other things that we mentioned, this is pretty key for being able to be successful. So when you have something like Jupiter and Aries in the 11th house, it promises wealth. But how much wealth? How much is it going to be able to deliver upon the good things that it indicates? It really depends on the conditions of the first lord in the first house. So here you can see the first lord in the first house are doing pretty good. So I think now you can see how you have something like a theoretical template of what Jupiter and Aries in the 11th house symbolizes. And that's like a seed. And depending on what part of the world or what different type of soil you put a seed in, it grows in different ways. If you want to understand the whole context of your chart, the soil in which your interpretive seeds grow, then visit my website, vicdecara.com, and click Readings. My complete chart report explains each and every nook and cranny of your chart and will keep you occupied in self-discovery for years. I also have 2 groundbreaking new reports. The first of these, Your Nakshatra, organizes your active nakshatras in order of their importance to you and presents the fundamental interpretations for the planets that occupy them. The newest report, Star Strength, uses a system called Tara-Bala to unfold 90 interpretations of the nuanced relationships between all the planets in your chart, which paints a rich and detailed picture of how your various strengths cooperate or compete with each other. Order these or any of my reports and accelerate your journey to deeper self-understanding.